Yes, good. Welcome everybody to this event, which is a joint presentation of the Environmental Science Colloquium Series, which is hosted here at the Department of Environmental Science at Stockholm University, and also the EcoRisk ITN project, which is a European Union initial training network project, which has been running for several years. And this panel discussion is part of the training network's massive online course that is ongoing and which you can find information about on the EcoRisk 2050 website. I'm Matthew MacLeod. I'm Professor of Environmental Science at Stockholm University, and I'm also one of the co-PIs in the EcoRisk 2050 project. So I'm involved in both sides of the host organizations for this webinar. Today, we're going to talk about whether it is time for a global science policy body for chemicals. And the context or the hook that we put into the introduction or the title for this discussion session is Summoning the Lorax. And if you are not familiar with the Lorax, this is the book that the Lorax is introduced in. It's actually recently just celebrated its 50th anniversary. It's a Dr. Seuss book, so you know, in theory, it's a book for children. But actually, I was just talking to my mother the other day, and she told me that they would never read this to me because it was too depressing. So if you've done your homework and have read the Lorax prior to this discussion session, you'll already know that the book begins with a story about how the world was way back in the day, when the grass was green and the ponds were wet and the clouds were clean. And what happens is, into this idyllic world comes an industry which starts to chop down the trees, the truffula trees, which exist in this Dr. Seuss world. And actually, on the surface, the Lorax is about deforestation, because as the trees get chopped down, the environmental quality gets worse. And actually, when the first tree is chopped down, out of the stump pops the Lorax. And the Lorax is a little monkey kind of looking beast who comes out and starts to complain about all of the environmental degradation that's going on. And although most of the book seems to be about deforestation only, it's actually also a lot about chemical pollution, because one of the things that the Lorax gives the industry who's come into the area a hard time about is, what are you going to do with all this leftover goo? And there are at least 3 different kinds of chemical pollutants that are featured in the story. There's smogulous smoke, there's gluppity glup, and there's schloppity schlop. And the Lorax spends quite a bit of time complaining about the emissions and impacts of all of this chemical pollution on the environment. So really, the analogy I wanted to make with the title is that the Lorax is like a global science policy body for chemicals. The Lorax assessed the sources of pollution to the environment. He identified hazards and impacts, and he made recommendations about what to do about it. And this is what I think we want a global science policy body to do. In the book, of course, the Lorax was not listened to. Business is business and business must grow. He was kind of pushed out. And in the end, there is a real environmental tragedy at the end of the book, which is why it's a depressing story. So the question, I think, open for question is, can we do better with a global science policy body than the Lorax did in the Dr. Seuss story? And to discuss this, we have a really distinguished panel of speakers who are going to make short presentations of about 10 minutes each to introduce different aspects of the question of whether it is time to establish a global science policy body for chemical pollution. First will be Linn Persson, who's now head of international development at the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, but who has for many years been an affiliated researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute. Marlene Ågerstrand, who's my colleague here at Stockholm University, assistant professor in environmental science and a board member of the International Panel on Chemical Pollution. And Henrik Selin, who's joining us from Boston University in the United States, who's the incoming editor, if I understand correctly, Henrik, of the journal Global Environmental Politics, and is an expert on international science policy bodies and international policy for environmental issues. So we're going to proceed with each of the speakers in this order, who will give us their perspectives. Actually, Linn will first talk about the current state of the global environment with respect to chemical pollution. Marlene will talk about the proposal for establishing an international panel on chemical pollution, and Henrik will criticize all of us and give us insights from his perspective. So Linn, I invite you. Actually, I'll stop sharing because I've got your slides, but you can get your.
I will do my thing by unmuting myself.
Yes, you can unmute yourself and get ready. Here come your slides. Good.
Great, thank you so much, Matt, and thank you to the organizers, all of you, for inviting me to present here today. It's really a pleasure being here, and I'm so much looking forward to the discussions. This is a topic that I really look forward to diving into. So if you go to the next slide for me, please, Matt. The work I'm presenting here today is the result of a truly collaborative effort. It started off with a workshop in the spring of 2020, organized by Stockholm Resilience Center, and after the workshop we continued with intensive digital discussions for over a year, and the focus of it all was the somewhat eluding planetary boundary of novel entities. If you go to the next slide, please. So, and you can push one more time, Matt, please, because then we'll get the red circle around novel entities. Here we go. So here you see the novel entities in the planetary boundary framework that was identified by Rockström and Stefan in 2009. They identified 9 processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the Earth system, and they also defined boundaries for these processes. They proposed that within these boundaries, humanity can live well for generations to come, whereas if we cross them, we risk large-scale changes to the world as we know it, and maybe also irreversible change to the global environment. And then at the time when this was published, you can press one more time, please, Matt, and then we will get the list of the original publications. If you want to have a quick look at these. So at the time when it was first published, the novel entities boundary was called chemical pollution. So that was, yeah, thanks. This is a trick, right? To do the slideshow for someone else. Yeah, so at first it was called chemical pollution. But when it was first published, then in 2009, there was no, several of the other boundaries were quantified, but not the novel entities or the chemical pollution one. And after it was published, it sort of triggered a lot of interest and a lot of work with many people who were interested in trying to pinpoint or find out more of, is it possible to quantify, how could we do that? So here are some of the papers, but there are many others also of relevance. And so Diamond et al. Looked at the scope of the boundary and discussed different possible indicators. I did work together with today's moderator and others, where we took another approach and looked at if we could sort of establish profiles that would identify chemicals that had the potential to cause this planetary scale of problems. And other people have looked at other aspects. Villarrubia Gomez and others looked at the role of plastic as a sort of a subset within this problem. Okay, so this is a little bit about the background. So if you move then to the next slide, Matt, thanks. This is the approach that we take in the paper I'm focusing on today. And we chose to start off by what is called an impact pathway. So look at the way the novel entities go from natural resource extraction, production capacity to production and use, environmental release, and then eventually also distribution in the environment, exposure of the Earth system, and then eventually, if you're unlucky, disturbances of the Earth system processes. And we use this impact pathway as a basis for discussion on how could you possibly sort of try to measure or indicate the boundary of novel entities. And we argue that in order to have a good sort of indicator or control variable, as they are called in the planetary boundary framework, you want it to be feasible, so it should be possible to measure. You want it to be comprehensive, that is, you want it to sort of capture the planetary scale. And you also want it to be robust. You want it to be able to robustly link your control variable to the effect of the Earth system that you are looking at. So based on this, we move ahead and we try to before leaving this picture, I will just note for you also that with these criteria of feasibility and comprehensiveness and so on, we also note that where you choose to go in and define your control variable will give different a different outcome in terms of these criteria. So control variables will tend to be easier to measure further to the left, so closer to the production, whereas maybe the comprehensiveness and the relevance will be higher to the right, where you get closer to the actual effect that you want to measure. So if you take the next slide, Matt, we suggest a set of control variables that together could inform us on the state of this planetary boundary. And they are spread out along this impact pathway. So when it comes to production and use volumes, we suggest 3 different possible control variables: trends in production volume of chemicals, trends in production volume of plastics, and then also share of chemicals on the market that have been that for which we have produced safety data or for which there have been a regulatory assessment. And then when it comes to concentrations in the environment, there are two control variables: trends in emission quantities of hazardous chemicals is one, and trends in release quantities of plastics into the environment is the other. And for the Earth system effects, we have toxicity of chemical pollution and disturbance to biosphere integrity by plastic pollution. So you see, they are somewhat different, and for all of them, you can also do sort of subgroups. You can look at subgroups in production volumes, for instance. So what we do in this paper is that we try to make a qualitative assessment. Where do we stand on each of these? It's not possible today with the data we have available to make an assessment in numbers or a full quantification based on these control variables, but we make an assessment on the data that is available, the scattered information that we have. And we note that the trends in production are that we have a rapidly increasing production, both of chemicals in general and also then of plastics as a subset issue. And we see also that even though we have improved our emission controls in many ways, we still see increasing emission rates of many types of substances, including plastics. And for Earth system effects, there are increasing number of reports of effects at different places and at different spaces. But in general, it is a dire picture that you look at when you look at these production when you look at these controlled variables. And we can also see that the seventh one, the share of chemicals on the market that we have risk assessed, is not keeping up with the increase in production and the invention of new substances. And we can look a bit closer on this last point if you go to the next slide, please, Matt. So here you have the global production normalized to the year 2000 for a set of individual chemicals, for plastics, and also the consumption of antibiotics. And this is then showing what I said about the increasing trends. And if you give me some points, I think you can move ahead, Matt, and pick up that's good, thanks. So what we note in the paper is then this 50-fold increase of chemicals since 1950. And for plastic, we have similar figures with, I think we're predicted to triple by 2050, the global production of, or is it 2030, of plastic. It's going fast. And we can also note then that the increase of synthetic chemicals, this increase alone outpaces many other drivers of change, of global environmental change, such as, for instance, land use change. And it's not so often talked about, maybe. We have more than 350,000 chemicals on the global market, chemicals or mixtures, I should say. And if we then look at our ability to risk assess, we can see that even within the EU, where there have been a lot of efforts to try to keep up with the newly produced substances, we still have 80% of the 23,000 registered substances yet to assess under REACH. So based on this, if you move ahead, Matt, please, here's this, and you can click one more time, because then we get the planetary pie again, and this time with novel entities in the red. And because this is what we conclude from this discussion, that the way the trends are looking and the way these control variables are looking, we cannot be sure that we are within the safe operating space. And we therefore conclude that we are outside. And with this conclusion, I want to end with the last slide of saying something about what can we do about it then, or what would take us back, because this is a relevant issue. And then this slide, I think, will carry us nicely into the two other presentations. And this with the ways back, this is not covered by our paper, I should say. So this is a more of a summing up of ideas from different places. And based on what I've said, so one thing we could do would, of course, be to increase our efforts to assess risks, including then assessing the mixtures that we are exposed to and that the environment is exposed to. There is another proposal called the Global Minimum Transparency Standard, which would increase the transparency on which chemicals are used in products and global supply chains. And this is then lifted as an important first step to be able to do other regulations, because as far as you don't know what you have in your supply chains, it's hard to regulate. Another point that we lift in our paper is a possible cap on production. Is this where we are now? We cannot handle the inflow. Do we need to consider putting a cap on production the way that we are trying to do for greenhouse gases, and which has also been proposed for plastic specifically? Other things that could be done are some agenda items that we have on the table for the UN Environment Assembly that is meeting right now. They have pre-meetings this week, and I think the official meeting next week. So they have a proposal of an agreement on the life cycle management of plastics. We haven't seen what this will look like after the negotiations, but if it's a sharp agreement that takes the full life cycle into account, maybe this will be a really good starting point. Something else that's on the same negotiating table is the agreement. It's called the post-2020 agreement. So this is what will happen to the international agreement that we have in the field of chemicals and waste. It's called SAICM. And we need to, it has run out and it has to be renewed. And if this can be done in a good way, it's also a great opportunity to improve the international collaboration here. There is also the suggestion of creating a science policy panel that you will hear more about in a minute. So the points I've mentioned so far, they are all sort of on the international collaboration on these issues. But then, of course, you still have the national implementation. This is where it has to happen. All of the international agreements will eventually have to be introduced into national law and also actually implemented on the ground. And for many countries, this is a very challenging thing to do. And I also want to mention before I end that another aspect that we shouldn't forget here is that a lot of people also don't use enough chemicals today. That is, we also have to watch for the right to essential use, both of chemicals and plastics, for instance. The same way many people are lacking access to electricity or other things. So this is also part of the of our challenge. But I think I leave it at that, Matt, and back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lynn. I should have said a couple of things I forgot to say at the beginning. We are using this webinar version of Zoom right now. So most of you will not be able to interact with us directly by speaking, but we would like to take questions from the audience when we get into the panel discussion, which will start at the conclusion of all three talks. So if you have a question specifically for Lynn, for example, you can already open up the chat function at the bottom of Zoom and start to type in questions. And I will, as the moderator, it's up to me to curate the questions and decide which ones will be asked. But you can also, if you have specific questions for any of the speakers, you can contact them individually through email with questions for after the discussion has concluded. I should have also said at the beginning that we plan to continue. We plan to have a lot of time for discussion, or have ample time for discussion, and we hope to, or we plan to continue until quarter after the hour, since not everybody, quarter after 4, that will be if you're in the same time zone as Stockholm. So there should be time for quite a bit of discussion at the end. With that, I see Marlene, you have shared your screen, so go ahead, please.
I'm ready. So I'm here today primarily as a board representative from Ipcc. I'm a board member there since a year or so. So Ipcc is a global network of independent scientists, and we aim to provide leadership in identifying priority topics of concern and bridging this gap that we see between science, policy, and the public. We've been around since 2008, and Ipcc has before. I don't want to take credit for anything of the things that have been done, but so I just want to be clear on that. But what they have been doing before I started was to write, for example, scientific reports for the Stockholm Convention. They have been involved in capacity building, training within SciComm, for example, and doing science policy communication, for example, with the concerning PFAS. And this idea of a science policy panel has been something that Ipcc has been working on for a long time. They have seen the need for that type of function since the current way we are regulating chemicals on a global level is not sufficient. And recently, a paper was published in Science with, from some of my colleagues in the board and previous board members. And in that paper, they identified identified 4 gaps on a global level that should be addressed to improve the protection of human health and the environment. And the first gap is that very few chemicals are regulated on a global level. And the second gap is that there is a need for an early warning system and horizon scanning. This is needed for us to be proactive when it comes to regulation of chemicals. There's also a lack of communication between science and policy. And also, unfortunately, very few scientists are engaged in these science policy discussions. And the recommendation forward them based on this identification of gaps is an intergovernmental body. and much very similar to Ipcc for climate change and the new intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. In this paper, they identify some of the key aspects when designing this intergovernmental body. And the first one is clear definitions of roles and responsibilities, a strict conflict of interest policy, and a rigorous peer review process of the outcomes from this body. And then for this to be a success or working, there's a need for a wide involvement from scientists and practitioners that has the knowledge needed for a panel like this. And also there's a need for an active communication of the findings with policymakers, the wider scientific community, stakeholders, and the public. And last year, a draft proposal was submitted with Switzerland in the lead, but supported by a number of countries to the UNIA Assembly. This draft proposal was on a science policy panel, and the proposed tasks of this panel was to undertake horizon scanning, and from that provide evidence-based options for how to go further, move further, undertake assessments on the nature and scale of particular issues and solutions, and also to provide up-to-date and relevant information and ensure communication between stakeholders. So this is now the draft proposal that will be voted on at the UNIA 5.2 meeting in 1 week. And in relation to this, Ipcc have organized 2 campaigns. The first one is that we have encouraged scientists and practitioners to write letters to governments and encourage them to support this draft proposal. And here are some examples of that. And of course, there's a world outside of Twitter. It's not just as important as the world inside Twitter. But in general, the response has been very positive from many countries, including Sweden, are supporting this proposal. The second campaign that Ipcc has been running is a global sign-on campaign where over 2,000 researchers and practitioners from 90 countries have signed. And these signatures have been sent to the Commissioner for the Environment in the European Union and will also be delivered to this UNIA meeting. And I think 2,000 signatures worldwide show that there's a strong support from the experts within this field, and they feel that something is needed. What we have is not sufficient. But I don't believe that everyone thinks that this is going to solve everything, but it's going to be one important tool. I hope today that we will discuss some of the critique that have also come towards a panel like this. And I think it's important to address it and also interesting, and I think we can probably learn a lot from it. And I think some of the things that has been addressed is relates to the how successful Ipcc has been. So does better science automatically lead to better policy decisions? So with the example of Ipcc, they have provided excellent science, but there's, according to many, a lack of policy that actually has had any effect on the CO2 emissions. And also, if we create a panel like this, is this just a false hope that we are addressing the problem? And are we not, like, are we then, is this then preventing us from doing other things that we are possibly more effective? And then also regarding the funding, it's of course costly to develop a panel. So are we diverting funding from other areas that might be more important to address? Interesting questions, and I hope that we can discuss them further. And now, thank you. Over to Henrik.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marlene. You have to stop sharing.
Yeah.
Good. And now Henrik should be able to.
Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. First, I want to just thank Marlene for the invitation, and Lynn and Matt for being here on the panel with me, and also Diana and John for organizing this behind the scene and making sure that we're all here and live on the internet. So what I wanted to do is to start off a little bit about sort of the overall global governance structures for addressing hazardous substances and hazardous chemicals. Because the governance structure here is somewhat different from the governance structures that we see in some of the other major environmental areas. And I think that that is important for both talking more about planetary boundaries, but also the science policy body for chemicals. So if we are looking at other major issue areas like climate change, then there is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, there was the Kyoto Protocol, and then there's the Paris Agreement. If we are looking at biodiversity, where there is another panel, then there is the Framework Convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and then under that Framework Convention, you have individual protocols. So you have fairly hierarchical, centralized governance structures for addressing both climate change and biodiversity. And the same can also be said for ozone depletion, where you have the Vienna Convention, which is the Framework Convention, and then you have the Montreal Protocol under that. In the chemicals area, on the other hand, there is no overarching framework convention. We have SAICM, but SAICM is not a legally binding agreement. It's a voluntary initiative. So what we instead have, we have a number of freestanding independent conventions. We have the Stockholm Convention on POPs, we have the Rotterdam Convention on Trade, we have the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste and Trade, there's the Minamata Convention on Mercury. More regionally, there's the LURTAP Convention and Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution here in Europe and North America that have separate protocols for heavy metals and POPs. And what we're also seeing is that there's also a growing number of private sector initiatives in terms of various certification schemes that are looking at pesticide use in food production in particular. Some of these are by non-governmental organizations like Fair Trade, and but you also have a growing number of private companies of retailers like Lidl or Tesco and so forth that have their own standards for pesticide use within their own brand name product. So that means that it's a very institutionally fragmented governance situation that we are facing. And there's also evidence that sometimes the connections between the private standards and the legally binding treaties can be very controversial or at least complex. There's a project I'm involved in. It's led by Fiona Kinneberg, who's a PhD student at the Bavarian School of Public Policy at the Technical University of Munich. That also involves myself, Miranda Schroers, and Noel Selin, that is sort of looking at these relationships between the legally binding treaties and the private sector initiatives. So as Marlene said, there is this proposal to create a global science policy body on chemicals. And that was the paper in Science last year, for which I'm a co-author, joining other people, saying that the time is right to establish this kind of body. And the initiative is then basically shaped by the fact that there are these policy bodies in other areas. And the two most famous one, obviously, as Marlene also mentioned, is the Ipcc on climate change and Ipcc, which then relates to biodiversity issues. And the four issues that were then highlighted in that article is a lack of coverage, horizon scanning, lack of bidirectional communication, and not sufficiently involvement by the wider scientific community. Credit where credit is due. It was Matt who came up with the title for this seminar. And I think it's a really good title. I was very happy when he presented it, but it also made me think about, for whom does the LORAX really speak? In the book, the LORAX speaks for the trees. But if we're then thinking about this in the context of planetary boundaries and this new science policy body potentially, who does the LORAX really speak for? A couple of years ago, Bierman and Kim published an article in the Annual Review of Environment and Resources. It came out in 2002, where they take a somewhat critical look on this concept of planetary boundaries. And they point out critiques from different areas. One is more from the angle of Earth system science. The other is more from a development perspective, development studies. And the third is sort of critique more from the angle of science and technology studies. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail here because we were asked to do presentations relatively short, but it's something that I'm very happy to get back to during the discussions if people have questions about it. But the basic is here that the selection of individual planetary boundaries and what is considered to be a safe operating space is inherently arbitrary. It depends on safe for whom and different perceptions of risks. And if we have Earth system processes that not necessarily have a very clear single global threshold or even a continental or ocean basin threshold, what does that mean for the ability to set a planetary boundary? And also, are these planetary boundaries basically more sort of externally determined boundaries that are set by scientists, or are they supposed to inform policy, and are they then in fact more politically decided targets? Because that then also involves who the LORAX really speaks for, right? Who is there determining? So one of the things that Bierman and Kim point out in that article is that so far, the work on planetary boundaries have largely been taken place amongst people who hold research institutions in OECD countries, and in particular in Europe. There have been relatively little involvement by people from the global south, and it's also a concept that is definitely much more used in northern scientific publications than it is in southern scientific publications. So it sort of raises questions on who's at the table and who is doing the definition of boundaries and safe operating spaces, and how are we dealing with potential trade-offs among different groups. And I think a similar critique can be raised against this proposal for a new science policy body, because it is intended to be a global science policy body. Now, I put my name on the article, so I think it's a good idea, but I do think that, as Marlene pointed out, a good idea does not mean that it's a perfect idea, and there are things that needs to be considered, and there are things that can be critiqued. And here I think, drawing from previous work on international environmental assessments, coming out of the Global Environmental Assessment Project at Harvard, that sort of started some 20 years ago, where Bill Clark was a critical person in that. And they pointed out that there's definitely issues of scientific credibility, right? And that's about getting the science right, getting the most recent science, and that's about any conflict of interests and so forth. But it's more about getting the science right? It's also about the political legitimacy, and the political legitimacy is again about who is at the table, right? If we have this science policy body, who does that really speak for, right? Who is working there? So for instance, in Ipcc and everything that they are doing in their assessment reports and so forth, they have two co-leads, and there's one co-lead is from an industrialized country and another co-lead is from a developing country. So how do you bring in perspectives from all over the world to make it a truly global body, as opposed to necessarily a more sort of a northern science policy body? And it's also about policy salience, right? As in, the kinds of policy questions that are relevant in Sweden might not be the same that is relevant in Senegal. The ones that are relevant in Canada might not be the ones that are particularly relevant in the Philippines. So how do we make sure that the different policy needs are being met by a global body? And the last point to make here is that this science policy body is about informing policymaking, but how and where do we take action? So given the fragmented governance landscape, if the party identify a particular problem, which forum will then bring that up? Is that the Stockholm Convention? Is that the Rotterdam Convention? Is that SAICM? Is that the Montreal Protocol? Are we relying on the private standards? right? As in, where will the action actually be taken? And here it's also important to recognize that we're sort of talking about issues of policy relevance, but not policy prescription, right? The role of any science policy body is to inform policy making, not dictate policy making. And there are past examples of sort of successful science policy co-production around assessment criteria. For this particular focus on chemicals, I think one of the better examples is the development of the criteria for evaluating persistent organic pollutants, because that's about the defining a POPs, and that is very much a science policy hybrid that sort of assessment criteria came out of. You can argue that the 2 degrees Celsius target under the Paris Agreement is also a science policy co-production. Is not an inherently or exclusively scientific target, and it's not inherently a policy target. It's a combination thereof. And for those of us who have been around for a little while, we can also go back to the 1990s, and we can sort of look at the history of the critical loads concept in Europe for dealing with acidification, which again is not a inherently scientific approach, but it's not also a purely policy, but it is sort of a hybrid science policy concept. And there is where I think that the way forward is. And if you're interested in the sort of more fragmented nature of global governance and the sort of governance system for dealing with chemicals, I did a book a couple of years ago called Governance of Hazardous Chemicals. And then also more recently, I did a book titled Mercury Story, Understanding Sustainability Through a Volatile Element with Henrik Selin. And in that, we are focusing on mercury, and we're then talking about some of the problems of sort of clearly defining a planetary boundary for mercury specifically, and also talk about some science policy issues for how to move forward with addressing mercury more efficiently. And the final thing I was going to say, that we also did create a website for that book, mercurystories.org. So if you are studying or if you're interested in, if you're teaching systems analysis and sustainability, there are some free teaching resources there. There is, if you want to sort of run an exercise in your classroom and have students looking at a sustainability issue, and like mercury or chemicals or something from a systems perspective, there's sort of a step-by-step teaching module for how to do that. And I will stop there and say thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussions.
Very good. Thank you, Henrik, Linn, Marlene, all of you for very clear, concise presentations. I'll invite again the members of the audience to type questions that you would like addressed into the chat, but maybe I'll start with one that popped into my head actually during your presentation, Henrik. On one of your slides, you talked about bidirectional communication, or you cited this. Who are the 2 participants in this bidirectional communication that you were referring to?
Yes, and Marlene, please feel free to jump in on that one as well. I think it's one of the advantages that I see of an existing permanent global science policy body for chemicals is that it creates a forum where scientists and researchers and national policymakers can interact. Because like the Ipcc, it's an intergovernmental panel, right? That means that you have government-appointed scientists who are doing the preparatory work, who are doing the reports and the assessments and all of that. But then in finalizing the report and including for the summary for policymakers, there is then a clear dialogue between the researchers and the government representatives of the various countries. Now, we know from Ipcc that sometimes that can be a little bit of a contentious. There's some push around language, some want stronger language, some want weaker language, and so forth. So it's not necessarily always a super easy process, but I think that there's still value to this process because you have the scientific perspective and you have the different political perspectives and policy perspective, and then trying to come to this conclusion where you have in a report an assessment that can inform policy, but not prescribe policy.
Okay, I wonder then, so your bidirectional communicators are scientists and policymakers. My impression is that a lot of the influence that the Ipcc has is actually not directly on policymakers, but it's on the public. You publish these Ipcc reports every whatever it is, every 2 years, and they get a huge amount of press. And they're not necessarily, like in one of your slides, Marlene, you talked about how a benefit of the IPCP might be better science. But I think actually from a scientific perspective, the role of the Ipcc is to collect all the science that's already going on. Maybe they set priorities for science, but to me, it seems like a big role for the Ipcc reports is science communication. Stuff that scientists already know, getting it out there into the public. Once the public is informed, they can be radicalized and turn into Greta Thunberg types who then drive policy from the bottom up. So maybe my question is, Henrik, should we be making policy from the top down or from the bottom up?
Yes, this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and the sort of somewhat weak academic answer is both, right? But I do think that, yeah, I know we should all roll our eyes when I say things like that. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think that that was one of the things that was sort of surprising, that if you go back to the people that founded the Ipcc 30 years ago and ask them, do you think it was going to get this sort of media attention and this public attention? I think many of them would have said no, that the primary target audience was national governments. And we see that it's picked up by local governments, by cities, by civil society, by the media, by all the major newspapers. And I think that that's somewhat surprising, but I also think it's a very good surprise. And I think that my own personal opinion is that issues around chemicals do not always necessarily get the attention that at least I think it deserves. And that's attention from policymakers, attention from a wider scientific community, attention from media, and attention from civil society. So at least one of my hopes is that that media attention that comes with the IPCC, I don't think for a second that the same amount of media attention would come for a global science policy body for chemicals, but maybe it could get a little bit more than that. And I think that that would definitely be a good thing.
Yeah, I wonder, thinking back to Marlene's plot of the, all these roadmaps on the IPCC process and no change in the slope of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Hopefully we're getting to a point where there's a critical mass of public awareness, which drives this bottom up. Anyway, now I'm editorializing. We have a question from the audience about what you were talking about, I think, again, Henrik, about the role of the global south. And the questioner, Vitor Perez Vez, agrees that the global south is critical to the process, but he would like to know how an IPCP or some similar body could really be heard in developing countries. And he has a feeling that developing countries are interested in development and pollution is inherent to development, that this is somehow working against the public interest. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I would push back a little bit against the sort of basic assumption of the question, because if we are seeing under the Stockholm Convention or the Montreal Protocol or the Minamata Convention, there is a lot of interactions, a lot of engagement by countries from all over the world, including in the global south. And the question is often not so much necessarily not wanting to do anything about it, but not necessarily having the necessary information and the necessary resources. And here, one can at least hope that if you have a global science policy body that increases the attention to these kinds of issues, both in the media and scientifically and politically, then there might also follow more resources for implementation at national level. So we already have programs under the Global Mind Facility. There's other international programs, including some run through the World Bank. So I don't think that this is necessarily prioritizing development over environment. I'm not naive enough to, I mean, yes, there is some of that too, but I think that there's more to the story than that. And I think that by providing information, by providing tools, I think that there is reason to believe that there could be more action in both industrialized and developing countries.
Very good. I would hope so also. Marlene, I see that you're multitasking because you're typing an answer to one of the questions, but I want to ask you another question from further down. You talked a bit in your, or you mentioned in your presentation, and Henrik also touched on this point, that this intergovernmental panel on chemical pollution has to have some sort of accountability which reflects a lack of conflict of interest. And you actually said in your presentation that there should be no one, with conflicts of interest allowed to participate. And the existing IPCC, which is the International Panel on Chemical Pollution, I know that they actually forbid people who work for industry from joining. Related to that, Michael McLaughlin asks, compared to climate science, a lot of information relevant to chemical safety assessment is not in the public domain. It's actually held by private companies. So should that be influencing the composition and functioning of an IPCP, that chemical information is actually, a lot of it relevant to safety assessment is not in the public domain, but is business information? How do you think we address that problem? You have to unmute yourself before you can address that.
2 years into this pandemic. Okay, so I think, I mean, we already have that problem in European legislation. We have, we want to assess and manage hazardous chemicals, but we don't have enough information. The legislation that we have does not provide enough information. And that is a huge problem, and it's preventing safe conditions for the environment and human health. So we absolutely have to address that. I mean, and we can do it on different levels, but I think we cannot open the door for industry in a panel like this. It's not going to be, there are so many examples that this, it's not going to be, it's not going to be working, I think. Then it loses its whole function. This is supposed to be a panel with scientists giving advice based on science. It's not supposed to be a panel where people with an economic interest give advice. There are they have other channels for that, which they are using. So no.
I'm going to exhibit my ignorance here, but do industry scientists participate in the IPCC? Are there any Exxon scientists contributing to IPCC reports? Do you know, Henrik? I have a feeling no, because I think the scientists in this case are appointed by governments. But
so there are the lead scientists are generally nominated by governments, but then those that then are the lead authors can then reach out to others and invite others to participate. So it's sort of a combination of appointed experts and sort of invited experts. I'm not sure if I can sort of think of anyone that is directly coming out of a major fossil fuel company. But governments can then appoint different experts that might have more or less close ties with government, which might have more or less close ties with industries, right? So it's definitely still about sort of finding the right balance. And as we know, the devil is in the details, right?
Mm. Very good. Linn, one for you. You talked about these, this is a question from Eli Thorne. You talked about these different control variables that might, determine where the planetary boundary for novel entities lies. The question is, how exactly did you decide whether we had crossed the planetary boundary? How did you quantify this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And
who are you
smiling because you were in the group.
I'm putting it on you.
Yeah, no, but I mean, so what I tried to explain is that, I mean, we haven't quantified it. This is not done. I mean, we've said that these are control variables that if data was available, you could quantify them, and that they together then would inform us better than the picture that we have today. So what we did is more of a qualitative assessment, really, of these different control variables and the data, that the scattered data that is available for all of them. And we use sort of a weight of evidence approach then to say that to the best of our knowledge today, are we within the safe operating space or are we not? And we reached the conclusion that we're not. And we were sort of quite a big group of people working on this for a long time. So, I mean, the conclusion can of course be challenged, and we also put it out to people to discuss now. I mean, this is our best, this is the best we could do with what we have on the table, and we're very eager to hear other people's voices about it. But so the answer is no quantification, but a lot of discussion around it.
And an expert judgment that we were outside, which I think would be certainly vulnerable to these kind of criticisms that Henrik was talking about
yeah, for sure,
a bunch of Europeans sitting around on Zoom deciding things.
Yeah, I mean, we weren't really deciding where I mean, we're proposing this. We've also tried to be transparent with what we do, which is important, I think. But can I add something on the role of the Ipcc once I have the the mic, because I was thinking before when you were talking about the role of the Ipcc as sort of to summarize existing science, and that this summarizing existing science is indeed a really important task, and there was the same direction that this question goes, sort of who is summarizing, and that it actually matters then who is doing that. And by having an international appointed panel the way you do for climate and for biodiversity actually adds credibility. And that, I mean, you don't need, I mean, this is with a consensus that is formed in a transparent way, and that this can make a big change and increase the credibility, and also adding to one of the other questions, that an additional important task of the Ipcc would be to actually show the cost of inaction. So to the question that was raised to Henrik before, that I mean, the cost of pollution in terms of its hindrance to development is really important to lift, and Ipcc could do that with credibility, I would hope. And show that polluted ecosystems, they provide less of a basis for development than less polluted ecosystems. So this is also something to bring into the pot. Thanks.
Very good. More points in favor of an Ipcc. Stella Papadopoulou, supported by 2 upvotes in our question and answer section, wants us to play devil's advocate. And you did a bit of this, Henrik, talking about arguments against the establishment of a science policy panel on chemicals. What are the other arguments against the science policy panel? Why should we not do this?
Who do you want to go first? Me, Marlene, or Lynn?
Let's start with Marlene, because she raised the funding issue, and Stella specifically says, I see the funding issue. Let's avoid that one.
I also raised 2 other things, like or maybe it's the same, but if we do this, do we then think we have done enough? We don't have to work on other issues and so on. And I don't think that anyone that signed our sign-on campaign or anyone working on this thing that this will be the solution. But I think one important thing is to think about what else do we need, because we are all agree that we need to do something more than we do today. So what is that thing that we need to do, or things that we need to do? Maybe there are several things. And I can't see, and when people argue that this is not the right thing to do, I don't see them proposing other things that would make any huge difference or I don't see any other proposals. So I was wondering what else can we do if we want to address this on a global level.
Henrik, criticisms of the IPCP? Sure.
Apologize if my internet is a little wobbly right now, but hopefully it works. Yes, it's sort of, it's the opportunity cost, right? If you do this, then there are other things that won't get done, right? So the question is this the most appropriate thing to do? And one of the reasons I've come to the conclusion that yes, it is one of the things that should get some priority, is that if we're looking at SciChem, and I think Sweden went in with sort of establishing SciChem with some high hopes. And there's definitely some things that SciChem has done, but I don't think anyone really thinks that SciChem has delivered what the sort of the promises of SciChem was once upon a time. So one could sort of just do, you know, another version of SciChem and then another version of SciChem and just sort of try to coordinate. But that is largely more or less repeating what we've been doing for the last 15 or so years. So part of the reason for why I think that the science policy body could be worth trying, because it is something new. And we have seen positive effects, especially on Ipcc, as we've talked about how the media attention and public awareness and the summary of the science, like the science around climate change, is very easily accessible in the sense that it's all there in a couple of reports as opposed to in 10,000 different journal articles, right? So it does have benefits, and I think we've sort of come to the conclusion that it's worth trying a panel and see if that can sort of help elevate the issue and spur more action. But again, yes, I think we should ask ourselves, if we don't do a panel, what else can we do? But it's on that balance that I think that the panel might be better than the alternative.
But I'm curious, why do you think SciChem did not deliver as we hoped? Like, was it like the lack of funding? Was it like the structure, or?
So it's partially because it is a voluntary initiative. It's not a legally binding agreement, right? I mean, there were those that were pushing for basically a global framework for chemicals, right? So you sort of plate that, and then you put the Stockholm Convention and Rotterdam and Basel and so forth underneath that. But there was pushback because in all of the other areas, you start with a framework convention and then do the follow-up protocols. In chemicals here, you would have then started with individual convention and then added a global framework convention. And there was enough countries in the world, including the one I'm in right now in the United States, that says, no, we don't need a globally, legally binding framework convention on chemicals. But we will agree on SciChem. So I think that the voluntary nature, and then as in often the case in these instances, it is a lack of political will. And this is I think one of the potential weaknesses of this global science policy body on chemicals. If there is no will, there is no will. And I'm not sure that the body can necessarily increase the will of countries that don't want to take action or not do particular things, unless you get the Greta Thunberg effect, right? If it reaches a broader, the general public, there's more discussions in media, and then there is sort of more domestic pressure on governments to act, then there might be some incentives for do that. But yes, no, I don't think that we create this body and then magically there is a big wave of political will all across the globe. I think that that's potentially one of the quote unquote shortcomings of this idea.
Someone else in the chat is questioning your two-party model, Henrik. And this is Adeline Lai, and she asks about whether another customer for the products of an IPCP would not be the financial community. She's thinking specifically about sustainable investing, where investors are trying to put their money into baskets of companies that have environmental performance indicators. She suggests that these kind of performance indicators could be products of the IPCC for greenhouse gases, the IPBES for biodiversity and maybe the IPCP for chemical pollution. And this would then be another, I mean, it's another avenue. Here, instead of creating a Greta, you create a green Warren Buffett, right? Who is, what do you think about this? Is this, I assume we could only agree that this is another avenue for exerting pressure.
Yes, I think so. I definitely agree with this. And I think for something as complex as chemical pollution, it's so multifaceted, as you all know, then there is not going to be one single solution. I think you're going to need a multitude of things to happen, hopefully working together more than working against each other. And I think that this could be one. Another one that we've seen over the last couple of years is a wave of climate-related lawsuits against governments and corporations for hiding information or not doing enough. And the legal system could potentially also be a way of holding producers and users of particular chemicals that cause damage to farm workers or other people that handle them as another way of trying to motivate change.
Yeah, interesting. Not only human health damages, but I suggest if people have never heard of it, that you Google ecocide as a crime against humanity, also or as a proposed crime against humanity, which is also a legal avenue perhaps for recourse against chemical pollution. Yeah, cool. A little bit of a technical question now, Marlene. Let's see if you can. Melissa Gomez, who I know works with the IPCC, she says the IPCC has 3 working groups that focus on different aspects of climate change and all contribute to the synthesis report at the end of each assessment cycle. Do you think that the IPCP has a similar structure in different groups assessing different aspects of chemical pollution, or have you thought that far ahead yet?
Yeah, maybe I need to clarify that. So I represent IPCC, which is a network of researchers, and that's not the same thing as the panel that we are trying to. There's a bit of a mix-up in the name, and we have a discussion if we should change the name of this, the network, the NGO that I am representing. So the panel is going to be something that an intergovernmental organization is organizing, like UN or on that level. So what's happening now is that in a week they will vote. The member states will vote about this proposal, and then if there's a yes, and then there is a working group that will be formed, and this working group will make a first draft of a proposal how this panel will look like, and then this will be a long process, and I don't have all the details on that, but and I'm sure that if there is a yes, this working group will have a look at the other panels on how they are organized and see how they can be, what can be learned from that, and what has been working and what has not been working, and so on. So I don't know that, but I know that if there is a yes, there still will be a lot of discussions regarding, for example, how do we define pollution? I know some countries will like to focus on air pollution only or primarily. How policy prescriptive should we be or not? What is the relationship with the other international agreements that Henrik talked about? What about the funding? And all these things will be discussed together with the actual setup. Who is doing what? How do we organize ourselves, and so on? So we don't know at the moment. But I'm hoping, and I think that we will learn from previous success and mistakes by other similar panels.
Yeah, if I can just add there, Matt, I think that the last point by Marlene is excellent, right? As in, the idea is to learn from the existing ones, not copy and paste, right? And I think that the model for IPCC works relatively well with the 3 working groups. I don't think that, my own personal opinion here now, I don't think that that would necessarily work as well for chemicals, right? Because I would find it difficult, given data limitation and everything, have a comprehensive report that looks at plastics, mercury, copper, and PFAS at the same time, right? But I can see a more targeted one on a particular type of heavy metals, and then a particular, PFAS, or like sort of more groups or categories of chemical pollution is, at least right now, what makes the more sense in my head, but I might change my opinion later on.
Getting close to the end, maybe 2 more questions. I'll take one more from the audience. Lynn, Eva Kumar wants to know, are we too late?
No, never too late.
Specifically with reference to the impacts of chemical pollution globally, and especially in the global south.
I mean, in a way, we're too late, because people are dying from pollution every day. So I mean, that's to say that it is, but I mean, it's definitely not too late to do it better. And we know that humanity can be quite smart when we try to. So, and we want to. So I mean, it's not. I think it's not too late. And if I can add maybe something to this last discussion also on the role of the potential IPCC, I think one important thing would be to focus on the solutions also in the working groups. I mean, you can do research on the problem, but you can also do research and summarize science on how to respond in the best way. So I think you would, in my ideal world, you would have a strong working group on the social science, looking at the effectiveness of different types of policy responses to the problems we have, because the other part of the problem we know more about, I would say. So that's also just to add to that question.
Yeah, very good. Maybe the last question for you, Marlene, because we're getting close to the 1/4 now. You mentioned that there will be this voting on this draft resolution, which is a first step, as I understand, towards the foundation of an intergovernmental panel on chemical pollution. How does it look? If you had to make a prediction right now, I'm going to go from here to a betting website where I'm going to wager 100 Swedish crowns on the outcome of the meeting.
Yeah, I would bet on yes. And the reason why, this is, as I understood it, not all countries need to say yes, but no country can say no. And so far, we haven't heard of any countries that are going to say no. We have heard about some countries that will say yes, but no one has said, like, we will say no. I mean, countries that, in my mind, are countries that could say no is, of course, US. They have not said no to similar regulations, but I haven't, or similar proposals, but I haven't heard anything about that. Russia, maybe, China, Brazil, but I have not heard anything about that. So I would bet my money on yes. It's also
Henrik,
nice to feel.
Where are you putting your money?
I would vote yes too, especially since 100 kroners is not what it used to be. So I'm okay with betting that, yes.
Uh-oh. If you had to wager more than 100 crowns, you might be not. Okay. Lynn, what do you think? Have you been, I don't know if you've been following the political.
Well, no, I haven't been following that closely, but I would also go for yes, for sure. I would put 200.
You would bet 300 crowns even. Very confident. Very good. With that, I guess I want to thank all of you for really nice presentations and a nice discussion, and also to everybody who's joined us remotely for the virtual discussion. There's a couple of questions that still remain in the chat that I didn't get to or that we didn't manage to address. But I'd encourage you to contact by email the relevant speaker if your question is burning and you really didn't get it answered. And yeah, thanks everybody for your participation. Keep an eye on whatever communication channel you saw where you learned about this Eco Series and Eco Risk event, because there will be more in the future. And we'll sign off now.
Thank you, Matt.
Bye. Thank you.